All right, and we're ready to get going. So, hey everybody, and welcome to our latest Meet the Experts webinar from PlaytestCloud. I want to thank you for joining us on this Wednesday for a pretty important topic. Today we're going to be talking about prioritizing privacy when testing with children. First off, I'll give you a little bit of a tour of our webinar space. You'll notice on your right, not sure which way I need to point with that, but there's a chat area. And in there, just let us know maybe where you're watching from, say hello. So maybe, for example, I would say, hey, I'm Jake from Berlin. Happy to be here today, and that sort of stuff. It's always interesting to see where people are watching from. But more importantly than that, we want to make this as interactive as possible. So we have a section for Q&A. If you click next to the chat icon, there's a section for Q&A. That's the place to write any questions that you may have. It's a pretty short webinar. We're only going to be doing 30 minutes today, but we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. And as well, the ones that we don't get to, we're happy to answer via email. Claire or myself can help you later on. But yeah, I'll give a little introduction. For those of you who don't know PlaytestCloud, PlaytestCloud is a service which gives game studios access to real players to effectively provide game studios with outside players in playing your game in their normal environments. We've helped many studios do things like reduce churn, dropout rates, and improve first-time user experience and player enjoyment. We have all sorts of playtest types that we run, especially testing with kids, and that is kind of the main topic and the important topic we're going to be talking about today. And we work a lot with Claire over at PRIVO. I'll give you a little introduction into Claire. Claire Quinn has over 20 years experience in the traditional print media and then on the online and digital spaces, working closely with major child-directed brands and online services, supporting both safety and privacy issues. She is an expert in and has a proven track record in child online privacy compliance and has worked closely with a lot of regulators and organizations in the child safety space. She works with a company called PRIVO. We love working with PRIVO, and they have a lot of really great resources, and they help us out a lot, making sure that when we're testing with children, we are doing it in the most safe way possible. But Claire, thanks for joining us today, and we're happy to have you here.
Thank you, Jake. Pleasure to be here.
Awesome. So we're going to go ahead and jump in. Let me grab my 1 second here. Perfect. We'll start off jumping into the topic. And I really wanted to jump in with COPPA. That's kind of the big key word these days. And really, when COPPA was first started, it did wonders to protect the privacy of children online. Could you, just to get us started, give us a brief overview of what COPPA is and how we can make sure research is done in a compliant way?
Absolutely. So COPPA is the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, for anyone that doesn't know. It's been around 20 years now. I think it came into force 1998, but actually came properly into force, the transition period, in 2000, so 20 or more years. In that period, it's really been the gold standard in child privacy protection. Any companies that are in the US have to abide by COPPA for their users if they're children, 12 or under, so U13. And if they're a US company, COPPA also applies to their audience globally, which is a little known fact and can trip some companies up. It's enforced by the Federal Trade Commission in the US and also by states' attorneys general. So sometimes you will see an enforcement action in the press, headlines over fines for companies that have been using children's data in violation of COPPA from maybe the New York State Attorney General or the Mexican State Attorney General. They're pretty active in the kids space. So it's enforced by them. Now, what COPPA really does is put parents in control of their children's data and requires consent on a sort of sliding scale, which I can talk more to. So for every piece of data that you want to collect and use from a child, you need parent consent first, and the level of parent consent changes, sort of goes up the scale, the more risky the data. So for example, if you're just collecting a child's email address and you're not sharing their data, then perhaps Email Plus, which is like a notice and opt-in process, is okay. But if you're collecting video or audio or processing any of that or allowing kids free chat in your service, then you need a higher level of parental consent by one of the approved verified methods that, SSN, driving license, credit card. So it's a sliding scale of consent depending on what you're doing with children's data. And COPPA really supports parents. So unlike the GDPR, children don't have rights under COPPA, and that's something we can come to later. But it allows parents to be in charge of the data that that's being collected and processed about their child. There are different audience definitions under COPPA that it's really important to be aware of. So sometimes it's primary child directed. If the majority of your users for your services, your apps, are 12 and under, then it's primary child directed under COPPA. But you may have scenarios where you have some older audience, so lots of older users and some younger users, and that's called a mixed audience. And at that point, it's possible to use a mixed audience age gate and treat your audience differently. But I would say, interestingly with COPPA, having been around and been the gold standard for 20 years, there are changes coming. The FTC have brought forward their rule review, which is every 10 years normally, where they review COPPA and then update not just the FAQs on COPPA for businesses to look at and review and understand their obligations, but also actually amending the rule, which means that there could be some significant changes coming down the line in terms of COPPA. A lot of that's been driven out of new regulations from the EU, but we can touch on that a bit later. But I think that probably gives you a good idea of what COPPA is and what it means. Anybody with child users must comply with COPPA. And if you don't, there are serious consequences in terms of violations, enforcement actions and fines. In fact, I'm looking at this morning, and I don't want to scare everybody, but these are pages and pages of recent violations adding up to quite a few $1 million. So important to understand your obligations under it and comply with them. I think that probably...
That sums it up really well. And I think it's one of those things that, yes, it seems scary and definitely something we need to be aware of, but it's approachable too, and it's absolutely for a good reason, and it's something that if you know the direction you're heading, you know what to do, you can easily navigate these tough waters.
I think that's a very important point, Jake, because a lot of people see COPPA as a blocker, and actually we see COPPA as an enabler. So if you comply with the regulation, there is so much you can do with kids. For a very long time, we've seen companies blocking children or shoving into their terms of use and privacy policy, we're not for 12 and under, we're not for you 13s, don't come near us if you're not 13 or older. That's not a get out of jail free card. And what you should do is engage with the audience and really, work with them, because you can monetize a child audience, you can engage them, you can build lifetime value, and all of that's possible under COPPA. You just have to know how to do it. And there are lots of helpful resources out there, including companies like us, experts in that are sometimes a little bit easier for developers, for example, to work with than a legal counsel, in that we are in the trenches, understanding how to implement it, understanding UX, and really getting to grips with practical implementation of the regulation. But really, it's not a blocker. COPPA Safe Harbor, and I should have touched on that a little bit, but if you join a COPPA Safe Harbor like PlaytestCloud has, we as a Safe Harbor can deem you compliant with the regulation, and we work with you to make sure that everything is buttoned up and there are no areas of exposure for the brand or for the kids. But yeah, totally approachable, ways to manage COPPA, and it's not as daunting as it sounds. You're right, Jake.
Yeah, and I think that that's important as well. As game studios try to reach new markets all the time, for companies that make games aimed at kids, what are the first few steps that they really need to do to make sure that they are on the right track on staying compliant?
Yeah, well, I would say the first thing to do, if you don't have legal counsel, or you're not working with an organization like us, the first thing to do really is to understand your audience. Are you targeting younger children? Do you have a mixed audience? Because that will help you define your approach to them, your whole build, your user experience. and defining that audience, then you know what you're dealing with. You know which regulations are going to apply, or you can research and find out, or you can speak to people like us. Once you know that, you need to really, very important privacy principle in general, understand what data you're collecting. And you would be surprised how many big brands, let alone smaller developers and startups, have no clue what data they're actively, asking the user for in terms of, email address or, chat conversations. Understanding that data that's collected actively, but also understanding the data you collect passively through third parties, SDKs, implementations in your app for analytics, for advertising, etc. Because unless you know what data you're collecting, you can't then understand how to treat it compliantly. So that always should be the very first step in any process.
Absolutely. And, it's one of those things where you need to really almost do an audit in a way to kind of see what kind of data are we collecting, where's it going, and who's using it. It's COPPA and GDPR, which is another kind of tricky word these days.
Well, the GDPR and the Children's Code, which has come into force on September the 2nd, with that and COPPA, I would say, and I really think, there's a lot going on in the privacy landscape, and we've got regulations coming out of Southeast Asia and everywhere, and we've got new bills coming for teen protections in the US with a few senators that have written some bills around teen protections, so taking COPPA a little bit further. But I think understanding the data that you've collected, the notices, your privacy policy, these are all vital for getting it right out the gate. And the other thing, they are all things that you would include as your records under GDPR. So for those two key regulations, the data mapping is absolutely the very first step. And then you know what to put in your notices, because just-in-time notices in-game are very important, or in the experience, to tell the user what you're doing. And then updating your privacy policy to be very transparent and clear about your privacy practices. Those few steps will stand you in good stead for GDPR, for COPPA, and for the Children's Code. And I think that they will go a long way. The Children's Code has 15 standards. Those standards are very helpful in, even taking it further back than mapping your data, is really understanding privacy by design and building it into anything that you're developing and building. And obviously through PlaytestCloud's, you have a great opportunity to test your privacy by design with the users. And that means that you should really be focusing on getting privacy settings high by default, we call it. So when you're building something, the user should have everything switched off by default, and they should be able to choose to turn it on. So, for example, if you do have chat, or you do have data sharing of any kind, or they can share content, then have those settings off and allow the user to put them on. Have reporting mechanisms for any issues that happen. There's a lot of principles of privacy by design, and following those when you're actually in build process will also put you in a very good position as you move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we actually have a question here from the audience as well. Richard was kind enough to ask one. And if anybody else has any questions, feel free to pop them in our Q&A section. We're happy to address them. But he's asking, the future of kids' privacy, what's next? Laws are changing all the time. Rules are imposed by big app stores, and there are big changes on the horizon. What can studios really do to make sure that they're prepared for them? And, when is it likely that the rules will change and these FAQs will be updated?
Yeah, so the COPPA rule review, I think it was 2019 that I was in DC on the FTC's workshop panel on this, and they had 175,000 comments, and they are not actually that close to publishing. I think it will be probably early next year now, towards the end of this year, maybe early next year, that we see a change to the COPPA rule review. And then bear in mind these other bills I'm talking about that are going through. So two senators, and we've been feeding back on these bills, are bringing calls for teen protections as well. So anticipating that, because I think it's coming down the line, would be a sensible move when building anything new or developing anything new, because teens should have some protections, and we see that in the GDPR. I think the changes that have come out of the GDPR and the Children's Code are having significant effect already. We've seen some of the social platforms already saying that they won't be using interest-based advertising again with children, but teens as well. So, there's the impact of this is beginning to show in industry, and privacy protections are tightening up for all users, children up to the age of 18. We also see a lot of regulation coming out of Southeast Asia. India has a version of the GDPR, Thailand has a version of the GDPR, COPPA has it, China has its own version of COPPA, which is broader and more prescriptive. So, what I would say again for anybody developing games and sites and online services of any kind now is try and comply with COPPA and the GDPR, and the Children's Code, which is really part of GDPR. So, if you can do that, you are in very good shape to manage a lot of the other regulations that are coming down the line, because there's nuances and slight differences, but really you will be gold standard if you can comply with those two. And I think really understanding what we talked about before, Jake, in terms of know what data you're collecting. Have you built privacy in by design? Know what data you're collecting and understand what you do with it. And make sure your notices and your privacy policy are accurate reflections, and that you're clearly and transparently conveying it to the user. We also see with the app stores changes to tracking, for example. We've seen, the Apple Tracking Transparency Framework. We see the SCARD network. So they're already bringing in some changes that prevent, collection and tracking of children as well, and give users, maybe at or above the age of consent, but still children, more options about clearly understanding what's being tracked with their nutrition labels and the ability to opt out. So, all of this is going to have an impact on game development. But I think overall, the key message is, be compliant with COPPA GDPR as far as you can, even if you don't have legal counsel or a company like us to support. And really, follow some of these best practices that are coming out, because it will put you in a good position.
Absolutely. And, there's maybe more of these, you have your big tier A, huge companies that are working with this, and they have these legal teams, but then you also have these indie, smaller studios as well. And, for them, making games for younger players can seem daunting, especially given the privacy rules involved. Do you have any tips or anything they would say to smaller studios that want to make games for kids but don't have their own legal compliance team? How do you bootstrap this?
Yeah, it's not as hard as you might think. It's really, again, it all comes back to understanding, what you want to do with the kids' data and how you use it. So really getting someone to sit down and map out exactly what we've collected and what we're doing with it. I would say there is a wealth of information on certain company sites. Ours, for example, at PRIVO, and I can share those links. The ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office here in the UK, has a wealth of information and guidance in terms of GDPR and the Children's Code. Now, there's 15 standards in the Children's Code, and if you can follow those 15 standards, you're going to get to a very good position. So, an indie company, a small studio, a startup of one app could go to that information and get a very good starting place to follow some of those guidelines in terms of how they build and how they handle kids' data. And then, coming to a company or a safe harbor, there's not that many of us, but we can offer more cost-effective guidance and support than a big legal team. In our program, for example, we have some of the biggest brands you'll know in the market, right down to several small startups. But we can point people in the right direction to find that kind of information. And I'll share some links with you, Jake, to send out to anyone here today who might be interested in looking at the Children's Code, the ICO site, our site, for example. But that will give you a good starting point.
Yeah, it was actually going to be my follow-up question too. Do you know off the top of your head where, if I was going to look up for these 15 standards, where you could easily find them?
Yes, absolutely. So the Children's Code is clearly, if you search ICO, the Children's Code is, there's a whole portal on Children's Code on the ICO website here in the UK. So you will be able to follow that quite easily. But I can send a list to you and share it with you. And a few more resources that might be helpful. The COPPA FAQs will be helpful. The ICO site with the Children's Code. Our site has some good information on it as well that can help some of those smaller companies understand their obligations and requirements.
That'll be perfect. So yeah, everybody who's in attendance today, I'll send you a separate email with these links and that kind of stuff, following up tomorrow, probably, most likely. But yeah, kind of switching over to kind of more the restricted data kind of topic. We know that there are some information rules that we have to follow, that we're not allowed to collect X or Y data when doing mobile research with children. But what should we do when, for example, a child reveals one of these restricted data to us that we're not allowed to collect?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, understanding what is restricted data. We don't use the term restricted data. Under COPPA, we'd say there's certain data that personal information that needs certain levels of consent from the parent to be able to collect it. Then we would say under GDPR, you have special categories of data, and these can include things like sexual orientation, religious beliefs, health and biometric data, and you really should never collect that unless you've done a data privacy impact assessment. Now, if you're processing kids' data, every company really should have gone through a data privacy impact assessment. Mm-hmm. And a helpful tip is that there is a guide to how to do that on the ICO's website, which is very clear. And if you were to take that and go away, if you don't have the kind of support we offer or legal counsel, go to the ICO's website and download your DPIA form. And that data processing impact assessment will help you understand what you're doing, what you're collecting, and what you shouldn't be in terms of restricted data. You have to have a very special reason to collect that kind of data from a child. And if they were to share it with you and you don't have the right legal basis for processing it, collecting it and processing it, or the right level of consent, then immediately delete it. Just, if they've shared it with you inadvertently, say through video chat or text, free type in a sort of experience that they're in, then delete it and delete it from your servers. Because if you don't have it on your server, then you're not violating the regulations. If you haven't stored it, you haven't shared it with anyone, don't share it before you delete it. Just get it off of your servers. And there are rules, security rules around how you dispose of data. Make sure it's actually gone. Don't sort of delete it here, but then it be in a backup somewhere else, because you don't want to have collected or processed that data. Does that make sense?
That absolutely makes sense. And should we log it when we delete something? Say user, with a anonymized list saying we deleted sensitive data from this person, just so we know when we do something like that.
Yeah, in case you have some kind of follow-up action or a regulator wants to know, it's good to have a record that you don't have it. What I would say is absolutely key is don't have it. If they were to come into your back-end servers and look around, they shouldn't be able to find it. That's number one priority. But if you can keep a record that shows that you did have it and your actions and a date and timestamp for those actions, that would be very helpful as well.
Absolutely. Kind of switching gears a little bit. This was a question we kind of discussed a little bit earlier and kind of yielded an interesting clarification that I didn't really even understand about kids testing. But we were kind of talking about, with PlaytestCloud, parents sign up their kids to playtest. And sometimes maybe the rewards for participating in a study might incentivize the parent more than the child. If it's obvious during the study that the subject has not given consent or even withdraws consent during this unmoderated study, what should the researcher staff do?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because under COPPA gives the parent all the rights. Mm-hmm. So, under COPPA, it's the parent's right to allow you or whoever to process data if the parent has given consent. But if you clearly see the child isn't comfortable or happy, our recommendation, because it's not a legal requirement for COPPA, would be stop the process. GDPR is very different, and so is the Children's Code. And interestingly, the US is a country, one of the very few countries that haven't ratified the United Nations Conventions on Children's Rights. The GDPR and the Children's Code are very much written in line with the United Nations Convention on Children's Rights, and it's all about the best interests of the child. So the child under GDPR has the right to object to their processing, withdraw their consent, ask for their data to be removed. So absolutely, as general good practice, but to make sure that you're complying with those regulations. If the child is not comfortable and the child doesn't want to continue, then absolutely stop the process. If the child requests deletion of anything that's happened so far, delete it, because they have the right to request that.
Absolutely. And I guess butting in with PlaytestCloud in here as well, if you realize that, or if you have something you need to delete because of a COPPA violation, contact us. We're happy to replace the video and get you a new one. We want to help you throughout this process as well. But only a few more minutes left, probably enough time for 3 more questions. But yeah, let's just even kind of talk about too, it's an obvious good research practice that the topics for your research should be relevant to your age group. How should a researcher approach a study differently for an 8-year-old versus a preteen when it kind of comes into this privacy area?
Yeah, I guess it's that's a little bit more content-y than privacy, but what I would say is privacy and safety go hand in hand, and it's very much about making it appropriate for the age group. So, I think one of the things that's very important in this is, and it's one of the requirements of GDPR and the Children's Code, is to make any language around privacy notices and consent processes, etc., very clear and accessible to the age group. So, under GDPR, online services really need to write privacy notices that suit the child and that age group. So, they can use icons, characters, make it colourful and interesting, which you wouldn't do in a normal privacy notice. And I think, making the content age appropriate is absolutely vital. And I wouldn't tread on another expert's, because it's not my area of expertise, about the terms of the content and what's great for an 8-year-old and not for a 12-year-old. But from our perspective, the content should be privacy preserving, for example, not asking them more data than you need, making it appropriate to their age, making sure that it's clear and understandable for those particular age groups. And another good reference for this is the Children's Code, which talks very much to clear, accessible by age group and splitting out into age group. I'm not sure anybody's got it actually perfectly right about what's appropriate for an 8 and a 12-year-old, and a lot of it is really based on subjective, but there is research out there. But in privacy and security and safety terms, it's about appropriateness, not requesting more data from them and personal information from them than you need, and giving them clear accessible guidance on what's going to be happening and what their rights are and how they can, pull out or join in, etc.
Okay, and kind of as a last wrap-up question here, so we've talked a lot about all these different privacy things and things we need to consider. At what point should the development team start thinking about approaching privacy in their development process?
Before they even begin building, when you're mapping it out with your wireframes or however you're doing it, think privacy and safety from the beginning, because the key principles to all child privacy regulations is that privacy by design. So, when you have a settings menu, make sure that the child can report or contact you in a compliant way without sharing too much of their data, obviously, that their privacy settings are high so that they get the choice to turn on and turn off. And then in your user experience flow, make sure that you have little icons and pop-up notices that say, we're asking you for this because we need it to do this. so that you're giving very transparent, clear notice of exactly what's happening. So, you know, there's some very good information out there online about privacy by design and privacy by design principles, but think about it from the beginning. We've worked with many, many companies who haven't, and then, of course, trying to do things retrospectively in a patchwork when you've already, you know, your architecture's there, you've already got your build, and now suddenly someone comes along and says, you're not doing that right, you've got to rebuild it now. You know, that costs money. You've got to get it released in the App Store and submitted and go through the nightmare review process, which we all know is incredibly tricky and inconsistent. So, you know, get it out from the very beginning, think about it and follow some of those privacy by design principles that are clearly documented. And I can send some links to you for those, Jake, as well.
Absolutely. Well, that's our time today. Just a quick little update on kind of testing with kids and worrying about privacy and that kind of stuff. I talked with Claire earlier, and if anybody has any extra questions, something that didn't get covered today, or you want to follow up, feel free to email her. I just shared the email on the chat. We're always here to happy to help and send over some resources, as well as I will email out some resources once I get that from Claire. But I want to thank you, Claire, for joining. I want to thank you guys as the audience for joining. And yeah, we're looking forward to our next Meet the Experts webinar, where we can actually jump into these different topics and kind of deep dive into things that we need to think about when we are playtesting and running studies for our games. Until the next webinar, thanks for joining, and we will see you guys soon.